Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to dive into the intriguing and surprisingly controversial question of why museums continue to keep and display mummies in their collections, rather than send them home. Mummies captivate the imagination unlike any other artifact from antiquity. More than simple preserved corpses, mummies provide an eerie yet intimate connection to people who lived long ago. When examining a well-preserved mummy, you can see the hair, skin, expression, and even clothing of an individual who walked the earth thousands of years in the past. This sense of connection explains why mummies continue to be prized exhibits in museums globally. Yet some have raised questions around whether it would be more ethical to return ancient mummies to their original resting places, rather than keeping them on continual display in museums far from home. This debate has only grown over recent decades, as sensitivities around colonialism and the rights of indigenous peoples have evolved. Do living communities today have a greater claim on ancestral mummies than the museums that house them? It's a complex issue with arguments on both sides. Those calling for repatriation stress concepts like dignity, sanctity, and ritual. However, museum directors cite priorities like preservation, research, and public education to justify keeping mummies accessible on display and in storage collections. Looking at the debate from various angles shows why this controversy will likely continue. Even as cultural institutions become more responsive to concerns around provenance and heritage, the lure of the mummy. While mummies exist on every inhabited continent, the most familiar images today depict carefully wrapped Egyptian mummies from the time of the pharaohs. The dry desert climate, use of burial linens, and developed preservation rituals resulted in some of the most intact mummies ever discovered. This also created a sense of otherworldly exoticism and mystery around Egyptian mummies in particular. Even back in the 16th century, Europeans were fascinated and frightened by Egyptian mummies, believing they had occult powers. Starting in the 1800s, Egyptomania really took hold. Wealthy British gentlemen hosted unwrapping parties where they excitedly tore into mummies they had bought, sometimes destroying them in the process. The fictional Curse of the Pharaohs also caught popular imagination after the well-publicized death of Lord Carnarvon after King Tut's tomb was opened in 1922. Today, mummies still hold an unrivaled grip on popular culture. Recent DNA analysis revealing incest, diseases, and cause of death in King Tut only increases the human impulse to unravel ancient mysteries. Museums recognize that mummies are a key attraction and often use them as the centerpiece of Egyptian and classical antiquities exhibits. Whether it's morbid curiosity, academic inquiry, or cultural connection, mummies bring in visitors. Beyond Egyptomania, there are mummies from around the world that also have compelling stories to tell. The Chinchorro mummies of Chile, dating back 7,000 years, predate even Egyptian techniques. Incan child mummies sacrificed 500 years ago in Andean peaks show us the intricacies of Incan spirituality and death ritual. The Bronze Age. Tolland man found in a Danish bog still has a haunted human expression after 2,000 years. Bog bodies, ice mummies, even animal mummies all provide vivid snapshots into past cultures. This global diversity of mummies helps explain why so many museums aspire to have remains in their collections, even if Egyptian mummies remain the most iconic. Their allure crosses cultures and generations. Museums often say they keep and display mummies out of a sense of custodianship, safeguarding the heritage of humanity. However, critics argue this mindset can slip into patronizing attitudes about who gets to determine value and appropriate care. Debates around display. Public opinion has shifted over time on whether displaying human remains in museums is ethical and respectful or exploitative and lurid. Those arguing against display offer a few main reasons why they feel public exhibition crosses a line. It contradicts the wishes of the deceased for a protected burial. Remains have sacred meaning that can be violated by gawking crowds. It reflects imperialist attitudes by forcing their cultural perspective. It disregards human dignity to view corpses as collectibles. Advocates for ongoing museum display counter that attitude's branding. Exhibits as disrespectful or racist represent presentism, judging past actions by modern standards. They say display educates people about our shared humanity and interwoven global histories. Seeing an ancient corpse can provoke awe and empathy across the ages, in ways studying a text or replica doesn't. They also argue that taboos around death have fluctuated dramatically over different eras and cultures. What seems intrusive today would not have held the same meaning at the time of burial. Proponents believe honoring the original cultural context matters more than applying current values. If mummies were not sacrosanct in their own society, modern viewers need not treat them that way either. Yet perceptions keep evolving. For example, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History removed an exhibit on indigenous human remains in the 1990s after protests called it exploitative and dehumanizing. The exhibit aimed to study geographic ancestry, but was still taken down. Other museums have added sections explaining funeral traditions or spirituality around death to provide more context and perspective. Debates around displaying vulnerable human remains will certainly continue shifting. But museum directors argue that hiding away mummies would deprive the public of their cultural and educational value. Visitors interested in stepping back in time see their historical value, even as critics see such curiosities as morbid. The debate over repatriation. Separate from display debates is the argument that ancient mummies should be returned from museums in Europe and America back to their places of origin. This centers around accusations of looting, imperialism, and questionable archaeological practices of the past. Critics argue 19th and early 20th century colonial attitudes viewed native graves as treasure troves to profit from, not heritage to protect. The most vocal calls for repatriation have come from indigenous groups and archaeologists from Latin America. As hundreds of mummies were removed decades ago by foreign excavators, Peru and Chile have been most active in demanding return of mummies. Ecuador, Mexico, and Bolivia have as well. They view these ancestral remains as stolen property that still rightfully belongs to native groups today. However, the National Museum of the American Indian in the US takes a more nuanced view. They oppose any newly excavated ancestral remains being kept in other countries' museums. Yet repatriation decisions around pre-existing collections should balance multiple concerns, as there are good arguments on both sides. Museums strongly resist blanket repatriation policies, wanting decisions made on a case-by-case basis. They say the people calling for returns today usually aren't genetically related to the ancient dead, and the modern country of origin often doesn't equate to the mummy's actual cultural source. Plus, antiquities laws and ownership standards were hazier when excavations first occurred, so holding rights over some disputed artifacts becomes hard to determine definitively. They argue that once remains are excavated and preserved by museums, they become part of shared human heritage and can be properly cared for. Sending mummies back to their uncertain original conditions could lead to irreparable damage or loss, depriving everyone. Yet critics see such reasoning as paternalistic. They believe curators underestimate threats like looting and overstate the museum's role as saviors. Partnerships around loans and research access offer one compromise between competing interests. But the trauma of past grave robbing means indigenous groups will likely continue demanding permanent repatriation in at least some cases. Despite opposition, museums do increasingly repatriate artifacts on ethical grounds or after government pressure. The Smithsonian reburied native remains it held after the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.